My wealthy uncle left me his entire estate, including a sprawling Hamptons mansion and $2 million in cash. I thought my life was finally taking a turn for the better. But right as my lawyer handed me the inheritance documents, the door to the office burst open. In walked my parents, the same people who abandoned me in the freezing snow 17 years ago, grinning like they had won the lottery. "We are her legal guardians now," my mother announced, holding up a court order. "Hand over the check." What they did not know was that I am a forensic accountant, and they had just walked into a financial trap I had been setting for years. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. I have spent my entire adult life building a career from nothing, tracing hidden assets and exposing corporate fraud. If you are watching this and you have ever had a toxic family member try to claim credit for your success, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood does not always make you family. Growing up, I was the invisible child. When I was 16, my parents kicked me out of our house in the middle of a brutal Chicago winter because they needed my bedroom for their illegal poker games. The only person who took me in was my Uncle Harrison. He was a self-made millionaire who saw my potential when my own parents only saw a burden. When he passed away last month, it shattered my world. I was sitting in the leather chair across from Mr. Donovan, my uncle's trusted attorney. The mahogany office was quiet except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Mr. Donovan looked at me with a soft smile and pushed a heavy folder across his desk. "Harrison wanted you to have everything, Natalie. The Hamptons house, the investment portfolio, and the $2 million in the primary account. He knew you would protect his legacy." I reached for the pen, tears welling in my eyes. Before the tip could touch the paper, the heavy oak doors of the office swung open violently. The loud bang made Mr. Donovan jump out of his seat. I turned around and felt the blood drain from my face. Standing in the doorway was my mother Brenda, wearing a cheap imitation designer coat. Beside her was my father Richard, looking as smug as ever. Behind them stood my golden child sister Courtney, clutching the arm of her flashy husband Jamal. I had not seen my parents in 17 years, not since that freezing December night. Brenda marched right up to the heavy wooden desk, completely ignoring me. She slapped a thick stack of legal papers right on top of my uncle's will. "We heard the old man finally passed away," Brenda said, flashing a sickeningly sweet smile at the lawyer. "As her parents, we are stepping in. She is clearly unstable and unfit to manage this kind of money. We have a court order for emergency conservatorship. Now be a good lawyer and hand over that $2 million check to us." I sat there completely frozen, staring at the people who threw me away like garbage, now trying to steal the only gift my uncle ever gave me. Richard stepped forward and slammed a blue folder onto the polished mahogany desk. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. He adjusted his cheap tie and looked at Mr. Donovan with a rehearsed expression of faux concern. "Our daughter has not been in her right mind since Harrison passed." Richard lied smoothly. "She has suffered a severe mental breakdown. The grief has completely shattered her grasp on reality. As her loving parents, we had no choice but to step in and petition the court for an emergency medical conservatorship. The judge reviewed our doctor reports and agreed she is completely incapacitated. She is legally unfit to handle her own financial or medical decisions." I sprang out of my leather chair. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. "I am perfectly fine," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside me. "I have a highly demanding career as a forensic accountant. I manage multi-million-dollar corporate audits every single day. I do not need a conservator, and I certainly do not need the people who abandoned me 17 years ago trying to play the role of caring parents now." Brenda let out a theatrical sigh and shook her head. "See what we mean?" she said to the lawyer, placing a hand over her heart, as if she were deeply wounded. "The paranoia is getting worse by the day. She thinks everyone is out to get her. She even thinks we abandoned her when in reality she ran away as a rebellious teenager. We have been searching for her for years and crying ourselves to sleep every night." The sheer audacity of her lie made my blood run cold. They had not searched for me. They had changed the locks and explicitly told me never to return. But before I could expose their pathetic lie, Mr. Donovan picked up the court order. He adjusted his glasses and read through the legal document. His usually calm face grew uncharacteristically pale. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at me. "Natalie," he started, his voice thick with regret. "This order is officially signed by a state judge. It grants them immediate and total control over your medical and financial estate, pending a full psychological evaluation." "What exactly does that mean for me right now?" I asked, though my stomach was already tying itself into painful knots. "It means I cannot release the $2 million or the deed to the Hamptons house to you today," Mr. Donovan explained, refusing to look at the smug faces of my parents. "Legally, I am forced to freeze the inheritance account immediately. If I hand you that check or transfer those assets, I will be in direct violation of a court order. I could lose my law license and you could face criminal charges for circumventing a conservatorship." Courtney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She tossed her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder and leaned against her husband, Jamal. "Well, that is just tragic," Courtney sneered. "Looks like the strong, independent career woman needs her mommy and daddy after all." Jamal chuckled, brushing some invisible lint off his overly flashy suit. "Do not worry about a thing," little sister Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We will make sure your money goes to a very good cause. My car showroom could use a massive renovation, and taking care of your mental health is our top priority." I looked at Mr. Donovan, silently pleading with him to find a legal loophole. He gave me a barely noticeable nod, a silent promise that this fight was far from over. But for this exact moment, my hands were completely tied. The trap they set was airtight, and my entire inheritance was locked away behind a wall of forged medical documents. Jamal stepped closer to the mahogany desk, intentionally invading my personal space. He smelled strongly of overly expensive cologne and cheap intentions. Reaching into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket, he pulled out a sleek key fob. The distinct Porsche crest gleamed under the warm office lights. He began twirling the key around his index finger, a smug and arrogant grin spreading across his face. "You know, Natalie, it really is a tragedy that you are so completely alone in this world," Jamal said, his tone dripping with patronizing, fake sympathy. "You have no husband to lean on, no children to care for, just you, and those incredibly boring accounting spreadsheets day in and day out. It is honestly no wonder your fragile mind finally snapped under all that lonely pressure. But like I said, family takes care of family, and your little inheritance is going to be put to excellent use." Courtney linked her arm affectionately through his, resting her head on his shoulder. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Jamal is absolutely right," she chimed in, her voice high-pitched and grating. "His luxury auto showroom has been desperately needing an expansion for months now. We are thinking about opening an exclusive VIP lounge for our high-net-worth clients. We want custom Italian leather sofas and a full marble wet bar. Your $2 million will cover those upscale renovations perfectly. Uncle Harrison would be thrilled to know his money is supporting a thriving family business instead of sitting uselessly in the bank account of a crazy spinster." I clenched my fists at my sides so hard my fingernails dug painful marks into my palms. "You are not getting a single dime of my money to fund that shady dealership, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low but shaking with anger. "You both think you have won this little game, but you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically and turned her attention back to the lawyer. "See, Mr. Donovan, the paranoid delusions are starting up again. She is becoming hostile and completely irrational. We simply cannot have her causing a violent scene in a professional environment. Please call security right now before she hurts herself." Before Mr. Donovan could voice a protest, Richard yanked the office door open and flagged down a security guard in the hallway. "Excuse me, sir, but my daughter is having a severe mental health crisis," Richard told the guard, slipping effortlessly into the role of a deeply concerned father. "She is legally under our medical conservatorship and is trespassing. We need her removed from the premises immediately." A burly security guard stepped heavily into the room. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to leave the building right now," the guard said, gesturing sternly toward the exit. I looked at Mr. Donovan one last time. He gave me a sharp stare that silently commanded me to retreat for now. I took a deep breath and straightened my posture, refusing to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, the mocking sound of Jamal and Courtney laughing loudly echoing in my ears as the heavy door clicked shut behind me. I stepped out of the freezing air conditioning of the law firm and onto the bustling New York sidewalk. The cold wind hit my face, but it was nothing compared to the ice in my veins. My first instinct as a forensic accountant kicked in immediately. Secure the assets. I pulled out my phone and quickly dialed the private concierge number for my personal bank. I had over $200,000 in my own savings account from years of grueling corporate audit work and careful investments. If I could transfer that money to a secure offshore account, I could hire the best probate litigator in the city to crush my parents in court. A polite customer service representative named David answered the line. I provided my security PIN and requested an immediate wire transfer to a secondary account. There was a long, unbearable pause on the other end of the line. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard before David finally spoke. I am so sorry, Natalie, but I am unable to process any transfers or withdrawals from your accounts. A legal hold was placed on your entire financial portfolio just an hour ago by your authorized medical conservators, Richard and Brenda. The phone nearly slipped from my trembling hand. They did not just freeze the inheritance, they froze my own hard-earned money. Every single penny I had worked for over the past 10 years was now under their complete control. My credit cards, my checking accounts, my emergency fund, all of it was completely locked down. David continued reading the file notes, and every word made my stomach drop further. He informed me that the conservatorship petition was initially filed and processed over 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks? My mind raced back to exactly 3 weeks ago. That was the exact day Uncle Harrison was admitted to the intensive care unit after his sudden stroke. While I was sitting by his hospital bed holding his hand and crying over his failing health, my parents were secretly meeting with lawyers and a corrupt doctor to declare me mentally incompetent. They knew he was going to leave his entire estate to me, so they built an airtight legal cage around me before he even took his last breath. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision triggered by grief or concern. This was a premeditated financial execution designed to strip me of everything. I ended the call without saying another word. The devastating reality of my situation crashed down on me. I was completely locked out of the financial system. I had no access to cash, no credit, and absolutely no way to pay for my own life, let alone a top-tier legal defense. They wanted me destitute and helpless. They wanted me to come crawling back to them, begging for scraps, just like I did when I was a terrified teenager. But they forgot one crucial detail. They were dealing with a woman who spent her entire career dismantling complex financial frauds. I took a deep breath of the cold city air and checked my wallet. I had exactly $40 in cash. I needed to get back to my apartment to secure my physical documents before they realized I had a backup plan. Dưới đây là phần kịch bản tiếp theo. Bằng tiếng Anh theo đúng yêu cầu của bạn, không chứa tiêu đề hay dấu trầm lớn được tối ưu cho dòng đọc AI. I sprinted the 6 blocks to my luxury high-rise apartment building in the Upper East Side. My lungs burned with the icy New York air, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept me moving at full speed. I desperately needed to get inside my home to secure my passport, my encrypted backup hard drives, and my physical ledger of passwords before my parents realized I had hidden them in a false bottom desk drawer. The moment the polished silver elevator doors opened to my penthouse floor, my heart stopped completely. The usually pristine hallway was an absolute disaster zone. Strangers in dirty moving uniforms were carelessly tossing my expensive furniture, my tailored clothes, and my private personal belongings into chaotic piles outside my front door. My custom velvet sofa was shoved aggressively against the wall, and a heavy cardboard box of my designer shoes had been tipped over, spilling onto the carpet. Standing right in the middle of the mess, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly pleased with herself, was my mother, Brenda. "What on earth are you doing?" I yelled, pushing past a heavy-set worker who was carelessly carrying my favorite floor lamp. "Get out of my apartment right now." Brenda slowly turned around with a highly theatrical gasp. She placed a hand gracefully over her chest, acting as if my very presence terrified her. "Natalie, sweetheart, You really should not be running around the city alone in your fragile mental condition, she said loudly, deliberately, making sure the movers could hear every single word. We are just clearing out some of this unnecessary clutter. A highly recommended psychiatric facility upstate requires you to have a clean, minimalist environment for your long-term recovery program. I stepped closer to her, ignoring the workers. My hands were shaking with raw, unadulterated fury. You are not sending me anywhere, I hissed through clenched teeth. This is my property. I bought this condo with my own money after years of working 80-hour weeks. You have absolutely no right to touch my home or my things. Brenda let out a short, patronizing laugh. She tapped the clipboard with a brightly manicured fingernail. Actually, sweetheart, we have every legal right in the world. As your court-appointed medical and financial conservators, your father and I had to make some very tough financial choices for your overall well-being. Specialized psychiatric care is terribly expensive these days. Since you are legally unfit to manage your own assets, we went ahead and took out a massive second mortgage on this lovely apartment. The bank was more than happy to approve the maximum loan amount with our emergency court order. The sheer financial violence of her words hit me like a physical blow. My forensic accountant brain instantly calculated the damage. They had not just frozen my liquid cash. They had actively saddled my only remaining major asset with hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt. They had turned my safe haven into a personal piggy bank to fund their own lavish lifestyle while pretending it was a medical fund for me. The loan money is already securely deposited into a trust that we manage for your medical care, Brenda continued with a sickening, triumphant smirk. And since the apartment is now heavily mortgaged, we decided to lease it out to a very wealthy corporate client to cover the exorbitant monthly payments. The new locks have already been installed on the door, so grab whatever cheap clothes you can carry and run along now. We will send an orderly to take you to the psychiatric clinic first thing tomorrow morning. My eyes darted past Brenda and landed on Courtney. My sister was carelessly rummaging through a small velvet box that I kept hidden on my nightstand. It was not jewelry. It was Uncle Harrison's vintage gold pocket watch. He had carried it every single day of his life and gave it to me just days before his fatal stroke. Courtney dangled the delicate gold chain from her perfectly manicured fingers, looking at it with sheer disgust. This old piece of junk is completely worthless, she sneered, tossing it lightly into the air and catching it. Jamal might be able to pawn it for a few $100 to buy some cheap rims for the dealership. Do not touch that, I screamed, lunging forward. I did not care about the designer clothes or the expensive furniture, but that watch was the absolute only piece of my uncle I had left in the world. I reached out and firmly snatched the gold chain out of her hands. I did not push her. I did not even graze her shoulder. But Courtney always knew how to play the ultimate victim. She saw her perfect opportunity. She let out a blood-curdling shriek and threw herself violently backward against the heavy wooden wall of the hallway. She slid down to the carpet, clutching her arm and sobbing hysterically. "Oh my God, she attacked me!" Courtney wailed, squeezing her eyes shut to force out large, fake tears. "Jamal, she just tried to push me down the stairs. She is completely out of control." Jamal immediately whipped out his cell phone, dialing 911 with lightning speed. "Yes, I need police and paramedics at the penthouse immediately," Jamal yelled into the phone, acting completely frantic. "My sister-in-law has gone completely insane. She just violently assaulted my wife. She is under an active medical conservatorship and is having a severe psychotic break. She is a massive danger to everyone around her." Brenda stood over Courtney, shaking her head in mock horror. "You really belong in a straitjacket, Natalie," Brenda whispered softly so only I could hear. The trap was perfectly set. The terrifying reality of the situation closed in on me. If the police arrived right now, they would see a crying golden child and angry brother-in-law playing the fiercely protective husband, and a distressed mother waving a signed court order declaring me legally insane. I would not just be arrested. I would be dragged straight to a psychiatric ward, strapped down to a hospital bed, and locked away forever. They would drain my accounts and sell my luxury home while I was heavily sedated against my will. I clutched the cold gold pocket watch tightly in my fist, turned my back on my own family, and ran. I sprinted down the emergency fire stairs, flying frantically past floor after floor. I could hear the distant wail of police sirens approaching the building. By the time I burst through the back exit doors and out into the desolate alleyway, the sky had completely broken open. Freezing New York rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking through my thin corporate blouse in a matter of seconds. I stood shivering in the dark, wet city, with absolutely zero money, no credit cards, and nowhere to go. I had nothing to my name except the soaked clothes on my back and a single golden watch. But my parents made one highly fatal mistake. They left me with my brilliant forensic mind, and I was about to use it to completely destroy them. I survived the night sitting in a 24-hour diner, nursing a single cup of black coffee. When the sun finally rose over the city skyline, I headed straight to my office at the forensic accounting firm. Work was the only sanctuary I had left. If I could just get to my desk and access my secure company terminal, I could start unraveling the financial mess my parents had trapped me in. I swiped my keycard at the front entrance, but the security gate flashed a bright red light. Access denied. I tried again. Denied. Before I could ask the receptionist for help, my boss, Mr. Peterson, stepped out of the glass elevator. He did not have his usual warm morning smile. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep concern. "Natalie, please come with me to the conference room," he said quietly, avoiding my eyes. My stomach did a nervous flip. I followed him into the empty glass room, and he closed the blinds, something he only did when a major corporate audit went terribly wrong. He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished table. "I am so sorry, Natalie, but we have to let you go effective immediately," Mr. Peterson said, his voice heavy. My jaw dropped. I had just closed a massive fraud case for a Fortune 500 company last week. I was their top investigator. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I have the highest clearance in this firm." Mr. Peterson sighed and tapped the envelope. "We received a highly confidential package from your legal conservator this morning, your father Richard. He provided official medical records and a signed court order declaring you mentally incapacitated. The psychiatric evaluation states that you are suffering from severe paranoia and chronic delusions." I stared at him in pure disbelief. "It is a lie," I pleaded, leaning forward. "It is a complete fabrication to steal my inheritance. I can prove it." "I want to believe you, Natalie," he said softly. "But in our line of work dealing with highly sensitive corporate financial data, we cannot have an auditor with a documented psychiatric condition. The liability is astronomical. If our clients found out we had an investigator suffering from paranoia handling their private accounts, they would sue this firm into bankruptcy. Professional confidentiality standards require absolute mental stability. My hands are tied by the board of directors. Security has already packed up your desk." The reality of my father's ruthless strategy hit me like a freight train. They had not just frozen my bank accounts and stolen my home, they had systematically destroyed my professional reputation. They knew my career was my only way to fight back, so they completely neutralized it. I was a forensic accountant who was no longer allowed to touch a single financial document. They had cut off my only lifeline, leaving me completely isolated and defenseless in the corporate world. I walked out of the towering glass office building and felt the crushing weight of reality press down on my shoulders. Without my job, I truly had nothing. I wandered aimlessly for a few blocks until the freezing wind forced me inside a dingy corner diner. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth and counted the crumpled bills in my pocket. I barely had enough for a stale cup of black coffee. The waitress shot me a look of pity as she set the chipped mug down. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain, trying to stop them from shaking. Everything my parents had done played on a loop in my head. The court order, the frozen accounts, the mortgage on my apartment, and now the loss of my career. They had built a perfect cage. But as I sat there staring at the dark liquid, my mind drifted back to the last conversation I ever had with Uncle Harrison. It was 3 days before his stroke. We were sitting in his study, the smell of aged leather and pipe tobacco filling the room. He looked uncharacteristically serious that day. He reached over and gently tapped my hand. "Natalie," he had said, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You have built an incredible life for yourself. You are smart and sharp and you do not need anyone. But if something ever happens to me, those vultures are going to smell the blood. They will come circling back looking for a payout. I asked him what he meant, but he just smiled a sad, knowing smile. If they ever corner you, he whispered, leaning in close, you need to go to Grand Central Station. Find locker number 812. I have left something there for you. Something that will level the playing field. The memory hit me like a physical jolt. I sat up straight in the booth. Locker 812. I had completely forgotten about it in the chaos of his death and the shock of my parents' sudden return. Uncle Harrison was a brilliant businessman who never did anything without a contingency plan. If he knew they were going to try and steal his estate, he definitely left me a weapon to fight back. I did not have time to sit here and cry over my ruined career. I needed to act right now. I threw 2 crumpled dollar bills onto the table and rushed out of the diner. The subway entrance was just down the street. I swiped my Metro card, praying it still had a few dollars left on the balance. The turnstile clicked and I pushed through the crowd, rushing down the concrete stairs toward the platform. The screeching sound of the arriving train drowned out my racing thoughts. As I stepped onto the crowded subway car heading toward Grand Central, my forensic accountant brain started analyzing the possibilities. Whatever was in that locker had to be the key to destroying the legal conservatorship. My parents thought they had completely broken me, but they had no idea I was just about to start playing the game. I arrived at Grand Central Station, and the overwhelming noise of the rushing commuters instantly swallowed me. The massive main concourse was a blur of people moving in every direction, but I had absolute tunnel vision. I navigated through the labyrinth of marble hallways, heading straight for the lower-level baggage areas. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I found the bank of old metal storage lockers tucked away in a dimly lit corner. I walked down the row counting the faded painted numbers until I stood directly in front of locker 812. The lock was a classic 4-digit mechanical dial. I paused for a second, trying to steady my shaking hands. What was the combination? Uncle Harrison never wrote down his passwords. He always used dates that held deep personal meaning. I tried his birthday. The metal dial refused to turn. I tried the day he started his first company, still locked. Then a specific memory flashed into my mind. The day he took me in after my parents kicked me out. December 14th, 1, 2, 1, 4. I spun the heavy metal dials and pulled the handle. The rusty latch clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. I pulled the small metal door open, expecting to find a stack of emergency cash, or perhaps some untraceable bearer bonds. I desperately needed money to survive the week and hire a lawyer. But the locker was completely empty except for a small matte black box sitting squarely in the center. I reached in and pulled it out. My fingers felt the cold, smooth surface of the container. I opened the lid carefully. There were no stacks of $100 bills inside. Instead, resting on a piece of dark velvet was a heavy military-grade encrypted USB flash drive and a small folded piece of thick stationery. I unfolded the familiar paper and instantly recognized my uncle's sharp, elegant handwriting. The note was incredibly brief, but it hit me harder than any long goodbye ever could. It read simply, "They will try to take everything you have. Do not let them. It is time to use your profession to go hunting." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. Uncle Harrison knew exactly how ruthless Richard and Brenda were. He knew that if he left me a secret stash of cash, they would eventually find a legal loophole to freeze it. Money could be stolen or tied up in court, but information was a weapon they could never take away from me. I closed my fist tightly around the cold metal of the USB drive. This was not a care package. This was a financial arsenal. He had spent his final years gathering raw, unedited data on the people who abandoned me. He had deliberately weaponized my exact skill set. I was a top-tier forensic accountant trained to track down phantom money and destroy corporate criminals. My parents thought they had completely neutralized me by taking my job and my bank accounts. They had absolutely no idea I was walking out of Grand Central Station holding the exact blueprints to their total destruction. I could not use a public computer for this. I needed a secure terminal that would not track my IP address. I walked to a nearby public library and used a payphone to call Kevin, an old colleague from my firm, who owed me a massive favor. I had saved his career 2 years ago during a brutal corporate audit, and I knew he worked from home on a highly encrypted custom-built laptop. He met me at a small, quiet cafe in Brooklyn an hour later, sliding his silver laptop across the table without asking any questions. He took one look at my soaking wet clothes and ordered me a hot tea before stepping outside to give me total privacy. I plugged the heavy black USB into the port. A security prompt popped up on the screen demanding a decryption key. Uncle Harrison was always thorough. I closed my eyes and thought about his favorite chess opening. I typed in the corresponding algebraic notation and hit enter. The screen flashed green and rows upon rows of complex data flooded the monitor. My forensic accountant instincts instantly took over. I was no longer a terrified woman freezing in wet clothes. I was completely in my element. I started sorting through the massive hidden files, and what I saw made my jaw drop. Uncle Harrison had not just been sitting in his study relaxing during his final years. He had been quietly employing private investigators and utilizing advanced financial trackers to monitor the family members who threw me away. I opened a master spreadsheet labeled The Vultures. It was a complete underground ledger detailing the exact financial lives of my parents and my sister. Every single bank account, every hidden wire transfer, every maxed-out credit card, and every illegal shadow loan was meticulously documented. My parents were not wealthy retirees living a comfortable life like they pretended. They were completely drowning in debt. The data showed massive monthly cash transfers to illegal betting syndicates and high-stakes underground poker rings. Richard and Brenda had systematically gambled away everything they ever owned, and had quietly filed for bankruptcy in 2 different states under slightly altered legal names. But the most shocking folder of all was the one labeled with my brother-in-law's name. I clicked on Jamal's file and thousands of transaction records instantly appeared. His flashy luxury auto showroom was nothing but a massive, elaborate front. The financial patterns on the screen were textbook money laundering. There were huge daily cash deposits perfectly structured, just under the $10,000 federal reporting limit to avoid detection. I found dozens of fake invoices routed from anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He was washing millions of dollars in dirty money for some incredibly dangerous people. I sat back in the wooden cafe chair staring at the glowing screen. They had orchestrated this entire fake medical conservatorship because they were desperate. They urgently needed my $2 million to save their own lives from violent loan sharks and federal agents. They thought I was an easy, fragile target. But they had just handed a seasoned corporate investigator the exact blueprint needed to send every single one of them to federal prison. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, letting my professional training completely take over. The deeper I dug into the encrypted files, the more the horrifying truth came to light. The spreadsheets Uncle Harrison had compiled were not just casual observations, they were hard, undeniable financial evidence. I opened the primary ledger associated with my parents, and my breath caught in my throat. Richard and Brenda were not just bad with money, they were in deeply dangerous territory. The records showed a massive $5 million deficit tied directly to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. They had been funneling cash into underground poker rings and illicit sports betting networks for over a decade. The numbers painted a vivid and terrifying picture. They had remortgaged every property they ever owned, maxed out dozens of credit cards under assumed names, and drained their retirement accounts entirely. But it was not enough. According to a series of intercepted emails and shadow loan documents, Uncle Harrison had somehow acquired. My parents had borrowed heavily from a violent loan shark collective in Atlantic City. The $5 million was past due. They were essentially running for their lives, and the $2 million inheritance I had just been awarded was their only desperate ticket to survival. They did not want my money to send me to a psychiatric ward. They needed my money to stop the mafia from breaking their legs or worse. Then I clicked on the folder labeled Jamal. If my parents' financial situation was a disaster, my brother-in-law's was a massive federal crime waiting to happen. The files on his luxury car dealership revealed a highly sophisticated money laundering operation. While he paraded around in custom suits and drove brand new Porsches, the actual business was completely drowning in toxic bank debt. He had taken out massive commercial loans to build the flashy showroom, but the legitimate sales numbers were practically non-existent. Instead, the dealership was being used as a cleaning service for dirty street money. I analyzed the daily deposit logs. There were constant cash deposits of $9,900, carefully structured to evade the mandatory $10,000 federal reporting threshold. He was faking sales of high-end car parts and phantom vehicle maintenance to justify the massive influx of cash. But the commercial banks were catching on. The files showed 3 different default notices from major lenders threatening to foreclose on the entire showroom property within the month. Jamal was completely broke and on the verge of facing severe federal indictments. I sat back and stared at the Brooklyn street outside the cafe window. Everything made perfect sense now. The sudden appearance at the lawyer's office, the forged medical documents, the frantic rush to declare me mentally incompetent. They were all drowning in a sea of massive debt and impending criminal charges. They were desperate, terrified animals backed into a corner, and they thought they could use my inheritance as their ultimate escape plan. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They handed a loaded financial gun right to a forensic accountant. While I sat in the dim Brooklyn cafe meticulously reviewing the federal crimes of my relatives, my phone buzzed on the table. It was an alert from a fake social media account I used for background checks. Courtney had just gone live. I clicked the notification and the screen illuminated with the obnoxious glare of a high-end Manhattan dining room. I instantly recognized the gold-plated chandeliers and crystal glassware of a world-renowned Michelin-starred restaurant. My sister was holding her phone high to capture her best angle, completely ignoring the elite clientele around her. A massive spread of beluga caviar and freshly shaved white truffles covered the table. She was holding a glass of vintage champagne and flashing a blindingly white smile at the camera. "Guess who just came into a massive trust fund, you guys?" Courtney squealed into her phone, her voice echoing over the quiet jazz playing in the restaurant. The universe finally rewarded us for dealing with so much family trauma. Jamal and I are actually meeting with a broker tomorrow to look at fractional ownership for a private jet. Commercial flights are just so exhausting. I watched Jamal lean into the frame, wrapping his arm around her waist. He was wearing a brand new Rolex watch undoubtedly purchased with a predatory loan. "We are taking the dealership national," baby Jamal boasted, winking at the camera. "Big things coming." Then the camera panned across the table to show Richard and Brenda. My parents clinked their crystal glasses together, looking incredibly pleased with themselves. They were celebrating the successful theft of my entire life. They were feasting on my uncle's legacy while secretly owing millions to violent criminals. A few hours ago, watching this video would have broken my heart. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. But as I sat there watching them perform their pathetic illusion of wealth, I did not feel sad at all. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating sense of clarity. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, and they had just handed me the detonator. I closed out of the live stream and tossed my phone face down onto the wooden table. I stretched my fingers, taking a deep breath of the coffee-scented air. Then I turned my attention back to the encrypted laptop screen. I opened a secure, routed browser, protecting my connection through servers in Switzerland and Iceland. I pulled up the official whistleblower portal for the Internal Revenue Service. I did not just write a generic complaint. I meticulously formatted a bulletproof financial dossier. I attached the hidden bank routing numbers, the shadow ledger entries, and the exact timestamps of every structured cash deposit Jamal had made over the past 12 months. I cross-referenced Richard and Brenda's offshore gambling transfers with their fraudulent bankruptcy filings. I packaged the data so perfectly that any federal agent reading it would have no choice but to launch an immediate full-scale tactical raid. The trap they set for me was built on lies, but the cage I was building for them was constructed with undeniable mathematical truth. I stared at the intricate web of offshore accounts and shell companies on the encrypted screen. Jamal thought he was a criminal mastermind, but to a forensic accountant, his entire operation looked like a sloppy child playing with matches. He had left a massive digital trail of breadcrumbs, and I was about to lead the federal government right to his front door. I opened a new secure document and began drafting the most important audit report of my entire career. I did not include any personal grievances or emotional pleas. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not care about family drama. They cared about undeniable proof of federal tax evasion and international money laundering. I meticulously extracted the vehicle identification numbers from the hidden ledger. Jamal had been importing high-end European sports cars using falsified customs declarations. He declared them as salvaged auto parts to avoid heavy import taxes and then sold them to shadow clients using clean paperwork generated by his fake shell companies. I matched every single stolen VIN to the corresponding fraudulent bank deposit. I created a flawless chronological timeline showing exactly how the dirty street money flowed from illegal betting syndicates right into the pristine showroom registers. The documentation was absolutely airtight. To ensure the authorities could not ignore the tip, I included the exact dates and times of the structured cash deposits that intentionally bypassed the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. I attached copies of the default notices from his commercial lenders, proving he was running a fraudulent front rather than a legitimate luxury dealership. I even included the specific names of the corrupt customs officials he had been bribing at the shipping port. Every single piece of data was neatly categorized, color-coded, and hyperlinked to the original source files from Uncle Harrison's military-grade flash drive. When the dossier was finally perfect, I took a slow, deep breath. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A single click would unleash a total nightmare upon my sister and her arrogant husband. They would lose the dealership, the cars, their freedom, and every ounce of their fake social status. They had taken my home, my career, and my dignity without a second thought. I did not feel an ounce of guilt as I logged into the secure federal whistleblower portal using an encrypted anonymous network. I uploaded the massive data file directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS and copied the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI. I typed a brief message stating that an active international money laundering operation was taking place at the exact address of Jamal's showroom. I hit submit and watched the progress bar turn green. The files were successfully transmitted, and the encrypted connection instantly wiped itself clean. The trap was fully armed, and the timer was ticking. All I had to do now was sit back and wait for the explosion. 2 days after I submitted the whistleblower dossier, Jamal threw a massive extravagant gala at his luxury auto showroom. He called it a grand expansion celebration, but I knew exactly what it really was. It was a highly calculated performance to flaunt his newly stolen wealth and wash the very first withdrawal he had taken from my conservatorship fund. Because they had seized control of my finances, they legally had access to the $2 million, and Jamal wasted absolutely no time putting it to work for his own criminal interests. I sat in the dark corner of my cheap motel room staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. I had easily hacked into the showroom's wireless security cameras using the default admin passwords Jamal was too arrogant to change. The live feed showed the massive glass building completely transformed into a high-end nightclub. Valets were parking $500,000 sports cars, while waitresses in sleek black dresses carried trays of expensive champagne through the crowd. Jamal was holding court in the center of the showroom, wearing a custom-tailored velvet suit. He was smiling, laughing, and acting like he was the undisputed king of the city. Courtney stood right beside him wearing a diamond necklace that was undoubtedly purchased with my money. She was posing for photos and completely soaking in the fake admiration of the elite guests. But the most sickening part of the night was watching my parents. Richard and Brenda were dressed in brand new designer clothing, walking through the crowd with absolute arrogance. Through the security camera audio feed, I listened as Jamal pulled them aside to introduce them to a group of men wearing sharp dark suits. These were not local politicians or legitimate business owners. I recognized their faces immediately from the files Uncle Harrison had compiled. They were the underground loan sharks my parents owed $5 million to. Jamal confidently patted my father on the back and spoke to the dangerous men. He assured them that the family had just acquired a massive new medical trust fund, and that their past due debts would be paid in full very soon. He was using my stolen inheritance as collateral to keep the mobsters from breaking my parents' legs. Richard nodded eagerly, shaking the hands of the criminals, while Brenda smiled her fake practice smile. They were all completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They truly believed they had committed the perfect financial crime. They had locked the annoying daughter away, stolen her fortune, and used it to erase their massive criminal debts. I watched Jamal raise his glass to toast his underground partners, his face glowing with pure, unadulterated greed. I did not feel angry watching them celebrate with my stolen money. I just felt a cold, satisfying anticipation. They had absolutely no idea that federal agents were already reviewing their files. The lavish party they were throwing was not a celebration of their success. It was their final night of freedom. Through the grainy security camera feed, I watched Jamal raise his crystal champagne flute high into the air. He was mid-sentence giving a boastful speech about his unstoppable empire when the heavy glass doors of the showroom violently burst open. The loud bass of the nightclub music was instantly cut off. Dozens of men and women wearing tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers swarmed into the brightly lit room. The bold yellow letters spelling out FBI and IRS across their backs stood out in stark contrast to the designer gowns and expensive suits of the party guests. "Nobody move and step away from the vehicles," a lead federal agent shouted over the panicked gasps of the crowd. He marched directly toward the center podium, holding up a thick stack of papers. "This property is currently under a federal search and seizure warrant for suspected international money laundering and severe tax evasion." The elite guests began screaming and dropping their expensive drinks on the polished marble floor. Total chaos erupted inside the lavish showroom. Agents immediately began moving through the crowd, securing the perimeter and placing bright red seizure tags on the steering wheels of every single luxury vehicle. I watched them tape up the exact European sports cars I had listed in my whistleblower dossier. Other agents rushed straight into the back administrative offices, physically ripping the hard drives from the desktop computers and confiscating heavy boxes of paper records. They were securing the exact digital ledgers that proved the fraudulent sales. Jamal dropped his champagne flute. It shattered into 100 pieces at his feet. His confident, arrogant posture completely evaporated, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy. "Wait, there is a massive mistake here," he stammered, taking a step backward as two federal agents closed in on him. "I own a legitimate business. You cannot just come in here and touch my inventory." He frantically dug into the pocket of his velvet jacket and pulled out his cell phone, desperately trying to dial his high-priced defense attorney. "Drop the phone right now," the lead agent commanded, placing a heavy hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You are not making any calls until we fully secure this crime scene." Courtney began to scream hysterically. She clutched her expensive diamond necklace and tried to run toward her husband, but an officer firmly instructed her to stand back against the wall. In the background of the chaotic camera feed, I noticed the group of dangerous underground loan sharks. The moment the federal windbreakers appeared, those men silently backed away into the shadows and slipped out through the rear emergency fire exit. They knew better than to stick around for a federal raid. They abandoned my parents instantly. Richard and Brenda were left standing in the middle of the room, completely frozen in terror as the raid unfolded around them. Their golden ticket was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. I sat back in the dark motel room and took a slow breath. The first domino had officially fallen. Through the grainy security feed, I watched the absolute destruction of my sister's perfectly constructed fantasy world. A female federal agent approached Courtney, holding a stack of clear plastic evidence bags. Courtney was backed against the heavy glass wall of the showroom, her face completely streaked with ruined designer makeup. The agent calmly but firmly instructed her to immediately remove the massive diamond necklace and the matching platinum earrings she was wearing. Those specific jewelry pieces were purchased just yesterday using funds traced directly to Jamal's fraudulent offshore bank accounts. Courtney began to scream hysterically, thrashing her arms and refusing to unhook the heavy clasp. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that she was a wealthy heiress and that they had absolutely no right to touch her personal property. But the federal agents did not care about her arrogant delusions of grandeur. With swift professional precision, the agent physically unclasped the diamond necklace and dropped the glittering stones into the evidence bag. Courtney collapsed onto the polished showroom floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as the ultimate symbol of her stolen wealth was literally stripped from her body. She looked desperately toward her mother for support, but Brenda was no longer playing the role of the proud, adoring parent. The pristine illusion of their high society life had been violently shattered in front of hundreds of the most elite guests in the city, and Brenda was absolutely furious. She walked right past her crying daughter and marched directly up to Jamal. The hidden microphones on the security cameras picked up every single venomous word of their argument. Brenda shoved Jamal hard in the chest. "How could you be so incredibly stupid?" she hissed, her face turning a deep, terrifying shade of red. "We trusted you to handle the family finances safely. We gave you direct access to a $2 million medical trust fund, and you bring the federal government down on our heads. You have completely humiliated this entire family in front of half the city." Jamal looked absolutely frantic. He held his hands up defensively, desperately trying to calm his raging mother-in-law down before the agents overheard too much. "Listen to me, Brenda," he pleaded, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I can explain all of this. It is just a massive misunderstanding with the commercial bank lenders. I just need to hire a good defense lawyer to clear up the paperwork." "A paperwork misunderstanding," Brenda screamed, completely dropping her carefully crafted country club persona. "The FBI does not raid a luxury car dealership over a simple paperwork error, Jamal. You lied to us. You told us your business was entirely clean. You told us the money was completely safe. If those men from Atlantic City find out the federal authorities are crawling all over this property, they are going to kill us." Richard quickly grabbed Brenda's arm, aggressively pulling her away from the federal agents, who were now watching their domestic dispute with intense professional interest. "Keep your mouth shut, Brenda," Richard whispered harshly, his terrified eyes darting around the crowded room. "Do not say another word about Atlantic City in front of the cops." The criminal alliance was completely fracturing. The exact moment the money stopped flowing, their toxic family loyalty instantly dissolved into pure, selfish survival. Jamal glared at his in-laws, suddenly realizing they were more than ready to throw him to the wolves to save themselves. I sat back in the dark motel room and smiled. The morning after the federal raid, the absolute reality of the situation crashed down on my family. I had stayed up all night monitoring their digital footprints. By 8 in the morning, every single bank account tied to Jamal and his shell companies had been officially frozen by the federal government. His platinum credit cards were declined. His commercial lines of credit were instantly revoked. He was a man who lived his entire life pretending to be a millionaire, and in the span of 12 hours, he was reduced to having absolutely zero access to capital. He needed a massive amount of cash immediately to hire a top-tier federal defense attorney and to prepare for the inevitable astronomical bail. I watched through the hacked security camera feed of my parents' living room as Jamal stormed through their front door completely unannounced. He looked like a wild animal, cornered and desperate. His designer suit from the night before was violently wrinkled, and he was sweating profusely. Richard was sitting on the expensive leather sofa, nervously biting his nails. Jamal did not waste any time with pleasantries. He marched directly up to my father and pointed a trembling finger right in his face. "I need $2 million transferred into a clean offshore account by noon today," Jamal demanded, his voice echoing through the large, quiet house. "You and Brenda are going to go down to the bank and drain the medical trust fund right now. I need a federal lawyer, and I need to secure funds before the grand jury officially indicts me." Richard stood up, shaking his head frantically. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Richard whispered harshly, looking around as if the walls had ears. "The FBI just raided your entire business. If I suddenly withdraw $2 million in cash from my mentally unstable daughter's conservatorship the day after my son-in-law is investigated for international money laundering, it will trigger a massive federal red flag. The authorities will freeze that inheritance account too, and then we will all have absolutely nothing. We cannot touch that money right now." Jamal let out a dark, menacing laugh that made Richard physically step back. "You do not have a choice, old man," Jamal sneered, leaning in dangerously close to my father's face. You really think I am going to take the fall for this alone? I know exactly how you got that emergency conservatorship signed. I know you paid off that corrupt doctor in cash to fake the psychiatric evaluation. I was the one who introduced you to him, remember? If you do not get me that money today, I am walking straight into the prosecutor's office and cutting an immunity deal. I will tell them exactly how you forged medical documents to steal your own daughter's inheritance. I will trade your freedom for mine in a heartbeat. Richard turned completely pale. The arrogant color drained from his face as he realized the criminal he had welcomed into his family was now holding a knife to his throat. The trap was rapidly tightening, and they were finally starting to destroy each other. Richard paced back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his hands trembling as he ran them through his thinning hair. "You are trying to blackmail me in my own house?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a desperate, terrified whisper. "I am your family, Jamal. I am the one who welcomed you into this home, who gave you my daughter's hand in marriage, and this is exactly how you repay me." Jamal scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his wrinkled velvet suit. "Family does not mean absolutely anything when the federal government is seizing my bank accounts, old man." Jamal shot back, his eyes burning with intense anger. "You think you are completely innocent in all of this? You think you can just wash your hands, walk away, and let me take the fall for everything? Let me remind you exactly how we got our hands on that $2 million medical trust fund in the first place. You came crying to me 3 weeks ago when you found out Uncle Harrison was leaving his entire estate to Natalie. You were absolutely terrified about your massive underground gambling debts, and you desperately begged me for a quick solution. Through the hidden security microphone, I listened intently as the absolute darkest secrets of my family were finally dragged into the light." Richard stopped pacing and glared furiously at Jamal. "I asked for simple financial advice." Richard spat defensively, his face turning a deep shade of red. "I did not ask to be part of a massive criminal conspiracy." "Oh, please do not play the victim now." Jamal laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the large living room. "You knew exactly what you were doing every step of the way. Who do you think introduced you to Dr. Eris in the first place? I was the one who called in a massive favor from my underground street contacts to get you a private meeting with that crooked psychiatrist. I personally paid the $10,000 cash bribe up front, so he would write a completely fake evaluation declaring Natalie legally insane. You happily took that forged medical document straight to the family court judge and swore under oath that your own daughter was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. You committed felony perjury, Richard. You orchestrated a highly illegal medical conservatorship just to steal $2 million from your own flesh and blood." Brenda, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room, let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. "Richard, you specifically told me the doctor was a legitimate medical specialist?" Brenda said, her voice shaking with sudden panic. "You looked me in the eye and said, 'Natalie actually failed the psychological tests.'" Jamal turned his cold, calculating gaze directly toward Brenda. "Wake up, Brenda," Jamal sneered, shaking his head in disgust. "Your husband bought a fake medical diagnosis from a doctor who illegally prescribes narcotics to the mob. And if you both do not go to the bank and wire me that inheritance money right now, I am going to tell the FBI exactly where they can find the hidden transaction records. I will hand them the corrupt doctor on a silver platter, and you two will spend the rest of your miserable lives rotting in a federal penitentiary." I sat perfectly still in my dark, cheap motel room, the pale blue light from the laptop screen illuminating my face. My secure audio recording software was actively capturing every single word of their explosive and highly illegal confession. They were viciously turning on each other like starving wolves, completely destroying whatever fake loyalty they had left. The legal evidence against them was now absolutely undeniable. I left the cheap motel room an hour later, taking 3 different subway lines to ensure I was absolutely not being followed. I told Mr. Donovan to meet me on the top level of a dimly lit parking garage on the edge of the financial district. When I walked out of the concrete stairwell, I saw him leaning against his modest sedan, looking incredibly anxious. I did not waste any time with small talk. I walked straight up to him and handed over a thick manila folder containing the printed financial ledgers from my uncle's encrypted drive and the audio transcripts I had just recorded. Mr. Donovan turned on the dome light of his car and began reading through the documents. I watched his eyes widen in pure shock as he realized the absolute magnitude of the situation. He read the exact details of the illegal gambling debts, the corrupt medical bribes, and the massive federal money laundering operation that had just been raided. "I knew Richard and Brenda were incredibly greedy," Mr. Donovan whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "But I had absolutely no idea they were involved in this level of organized criminal activity. They committed felony medical fraud to steal your inheritance and save themselves from the mob. We need to take this directly to the district attorney right now, Natalie. We can get the conservatorship completely thrown out by tomorrow morning." I placed my hand firmly on the folder and shook my head. "No," I said, my voice cold and steady. "If we just go to the police right now, my parents will just hire a sleazy defense lawyer and claim they were manipulated by Jamal and the corrupt doctor. They might get a slap on the wrist or a plea deal. I do not want them to just lose the conservatorship. I want them to legally hang themselves with their own boundless greed. I want them to fall into a legal trap so deep that they can never climb out." Mr. Donovan looked at me, his expression shifting from shock to deep respect. "What exactly are you proposing, Natalie?" he asked, leaning forward. I outlined the meticulous legal snare I had spent the entire night designing. I told him we were going to use their desperate need for cash against them. I instructed Mr. Donovan to call my mother in the morning and pretend he was legally obligated to disclose a massive secret. He was going to tell Brenda that the $2 million they stole was just the tip of the iceberg. He would inform her that Uncle Harrison actually had a hidden offshore trust fund worth $15 million. But to access that massive fortune, the legal conservators would have to sign a highly specific document. A binding agreement stating they voluntarily accepted total legal and financial liability for all of my uncle's corporate entities and any associated past debts. Mr. Donovan let out a low whistle, completely grasping the brilliance of the trap. "They are so incredibly desperate and greedy that they will sign absolutely anything if they think it leads to $15 million, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They will walk right into the slaughterhouse without even looking down." The very next morning, the trap was officially set into motion. I sat in Mr. Donovan's office listening quietly as he placed the phone call to my mother. He put the phone on speaker and cleared his throat, adopting the perfect tone of a defeated and exhausted lawyer who was just trying to wash his hands of a messy family dispute. Brenda answered on the second ring, her voice tight with stress from the federal raid the night before. "Hello, Mr. Donovan," Brenda said sharply. "I hope you are calling to tell me that the $2 million has been unfrozen. We have emergency medical expenses for Natalie that need to be paid immediately." Mr. Donovan sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I am afraid the $2 million is going to be tied up in probate court for months, Brenda, especially with the recent federal investigation into your son-in-law's business. The bank is completely spooked, and they are refusing to release the funds." I heard my father Richard cursing loudly in the background. The panic in their house was palpable, but then Mr. Donovan dropped the bait exactly as we had rehearsed. "However, there is another option," Mr. Donovan continued, keeping his voice perfectly steady. "I was reviewing the final codicils of Harrison's estate late last night. It appears the $2 million in the primary account was just his daily operating fund. Harrison actually set up a massive blind trust in Delaware before he died. It holds the liquidation value of his previous real estate ventures. The trust is currently valued at slightly over $15 million. There was absolute dead silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear my parents' hearts stop beating. $15 million was not just enough to pay off the Atlantic City mobsters. It was enough to buy a private island and disappear completely. $15 million. Brenda finally whispered, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered greed. "Are you telling me we have legal access to $15 million right now?" "Yes, but there is a catch," Mr. Donovan said smoothly. "Because the trust is tied directly to his corporate holding companies, the bank requires the legal conservators to sign a specific release form before they will disperse a single penny. It is a standard acceptance of all estate assets and liabilities document. By signing it, You and Richard agree to legally step into Harrison's shoes as the sole owners of his corporate entities, taking on all associated financial responsibilities. Once signed, the $15 million is immediately transferred into your direct control. Brenda did not even hesitate. The word liabilities completely bypassed her greedy mind. She only heard the number 15 million. Send the paperwork to our house right now, Mr. Donovan, Brenda practically shouted into the phone. We will sign whatever you need. We are her legal guardians and we accept full responsibility for everything. Mr. Donovan hung up the phone and looked across the desk at me. We both smiled. They had just swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. I continued to monitor the hidden audio feeds inside my parents' house. Mr. Donovan had just sent over the digital legal documents for the $15 million trust fund. Richard and Brenda were sitting at the large kitchen table staring at the printed contract with wide, greedy eyes. They were completely ignoring the absolute chaos happening across town with Jamal. They had absolutely no intention of using a single penny of this new massive fortune to bail out their desperate son-in-law. We sign this paperwork today and we wire $5 million directly to the Atlantic City accounts tomorrow morning, Richard said, his voice shaking with intense anticipation. Then we take the remaining $10 million and we leave the country. We can buy a private villa in Spain and never look back. We are finally completely free, Brenda. Brenda traced her brightly manicured finger over the signature line. What exactly are we going to tell Jamal? She asked, her eyes cold and calculating. He is expecting us to drain the medical trust fund this afternoon to pay for his federal defense lawyers. If we just disappear, he is going to tell the FBI everything about the fake psychiatric evaluation we bought for Natalie. Let him talk, Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. By the time the federal agents figure out what actually happened, we will be completely untouchable in Europe. Jamal is a sinking ship, Brenda. He brought the federal government right to our doorstep with his sloppy, illegal business. We are not going to throw away $15 million to save a street criminal who got caught laundering money. He is completely on his own. They were so entirely consumed by their own selfish greed that they did not hear the soft footsteps coming down the hallway. Courtney stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes were red from crying all night, and her expensive designer clothes were still wrinkled from the federal raid. She stared at her parents in absolute horror. She had heard every single word of their treacherous escape plan. You are going to abandon my husband! Courtney screamed, her high-pitched voice shattering the quiet tension in the kitchen. She marched aggressively toward the table and snatched the legal documents right out of her father's hands. Jamal is facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary right now. He was the one who helped you get the fake medical documents to steal Natalie's money. And now you are just going to take this new trust fund and run away to Spain without us. Courtney, sweetheart, you need to calm down, Brenda said, standing up and trying to use her soothing motherly voice. Jamal made his own terrible mistakes. We cannot let his criminal charges drag this entire family down into the mud. We have to protect ourselves. Protect yourselves! Courtney shrieked, her face turning a violent shade of red. I am your daughter. You cannot just leave me here with absolutely nothing while my husband goes to prison. Give me half of that money right now, or I swear I will call the FBI myself and tell them exactly what you did to Natalie. The golden child had finally turned on her creators. The perfect family facade was completely burning to the ground, and I had the best seat in the house. While my parents and sister were screaming at each other in their kitchen, Jamal was sitting in a cold, windowless interrogation room at the Federal Bureau building. Through my secure digital monitoring, I had access to the federal court docket. I knew he had been temporarily released on his own recognizance simply because the agents wanted to see who he would contact first. They were hoping he would lead them to the underground loan sharks. But Jamal was far too terrified of the mob to betray them. He knew his only ticket out of a 10-year prison sentence was a completely different kind of crime. Jamal walked into a cheap electronics store in downtown Manhattan and purchased a prepaid burner phone along with a digital audio recorder. He had been completely abandoned by his wife and her greedy parents. He knew he was going to take the fall for the entire money laundering operation, unless he could hand the federal prosecutors a massive high-profile felony case on a silver platter. And he had the absolute perfect target in mind. Sitting in the driver's seat of a rented sedan, Jamal dialed my father's private cell phone number. I sat in my motel room pressing my headphones tightly against my ears as the audio feed from Richard's compromised phone connected. Richard answered on the fourth ring, his voice dripping with arrogant annoyance. "What do you want?" Jamal Richard snapped, practically whispering, so his family would not hear him. "I told you, we cannot transfer any money to you. The accounts are completely locked down." Jamal placed the burner phone on speaker and hit the record button on his digital device. "I do not care about the accounts anymore, Richard," Jamal said, his voice surprisingly calm for a man facing a decade in federal prison. "I just want to know why you are completely abandoning me after everything I did for this family. I was the one who tracked down Dr. Eris. I was the one who handed him the $10,000 cash bribe so he would write that completely fake psychiatric evaluation for Natalie. I helped you steal $2 million from your own daughter, and now you are just going to let me rot in a federal cell." Richard let out a cruel, condescending laugh. "You helped us because you are a greedy street thug, Jamal." Richard sneered, completely unaware that his absolute destruction was being captured in high-definition audio. "Yes, you paid the crooked doctor, but I am the one who filed the conservatorship. I am the legal guardian. You have absolutely no physical proof that the medical records are forged, and neither does Natalie. So stop calling me. We are done with you." Richard ended the call with a sharp click. I watched the digital audio wave on my screen flatline. Jamal sat in his rented car, staring at the saved audio file on his recorder. A slow, desperate smile spread across his face. He finally had his ultimate bargaining chip. He was going to walk straight back into that federal building and trade my father's freedom for his own. Late that evening, my phone buzzed with an unexpected text message. It was from Brenda begging me to meet them for dinner at Belmont's. It was the exact same highly exclusive restaurant where they had publicly humiliated me 17 years ago, right before kicking me out. The absolute irony was not lost on me. They intentionally chose the setting of my past degradation to stage their brand new desperate performance. I wore my sharpest tailored business suit and arrived exactly on time. When the hostess led me to the private dining room, I saw Richard, Brenda, and Courtney already seated at a large round table. The moment I walked into the room, they all immediately stood up. Brenda rushed forward with heavy tears streaming down her perfectly powdered face. She reached out, trying to pull me into a tight, emotional hug, but I took a cold, decisive step back. She dropped her arms and let out a dramatic sob, pressing a delicate silk handkerchief to her eyes. "Natalie, my beautiful, sweet girl," Brenda cried, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed fake emotion. "We are so incredibly sorry. Seeing you standing here looking so strong and successful completely breaks my heart, realizing how much precious time we have lost." Richard quickly pulled out a chair for me, gesturing toward an incredibly expensive array of appetizers already placed on the table. "Please sit down, Natalie," he said, his tone unnervingly soft and pleading. "We know we made some absolutely terrible mistakes 17 years ago. We were young and completely overwhelmed, and honestly, we did not know how to properly handle a teenager. We have deeply regretted the night we asked you to leave every single day of our miserable lives." I sat down slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight and completely rigid. I did not touch the crystal water glass or the heavy silver cutlery. I just stared at them in total silence, waiting for the real agenda to finally reveal itself. Courtney reached across the white tablecloth and tried to grab my hand, but I quickly pulled it away. "We just want our family back," Courtney sniffled, wiping a totally fake tear from her perfectly contoured cheek. "We want to be a real family again and leave all this ugly, terrible business behind us." "And what about the forced medical conservatorship?" I asked, my voice cutting through their theatrical performance like a sharp knife. "You actively forged psychiatric documents to declare me legally insane and froze my personal bank accounts. Is that your idea of a loving family reunion?" Richard leaned forward, placing his right hand over his heart, looking completely innocent. "We were just absolutely terrified for you, Natalie," he lied smoothly, looking right into my eyes. We thought the extreme grief of losing Uncle Harrison had completely shattered your fragile mind. We only filed those emergency papers because we loved you too much to watch you destroy yourself. We desperately wanted to protect your financial assets so you could completely focus on your mental recovery. But we see clearly now that we completely overreacted. We are just scared, panicked parents trying to save our beloved daughter. We want to drop the conservatorship entirely and give you your whole life back. We just need you to sign one simple legal document first to clean up the complicated mess we accidentally made. I picked up the heavy silver knife and fork. The waiter had just placed a perfectly seared filet mignon in front of me. I sliced through the tender meat with absolute precision, taking my time. The soft jazz music playing from the hidden speakers contrasted sharply with the suffocating tension at our table. My calm, relaxed demeanor was clearly unsettling them. They expected me to yell or cry or beg for my freedom. Instead, I was casually enjoying a 5-star meal. You were just scared. Panicked parents trying to save me, I repeated softly, chewing my food and swallowing before taking a slow sip of water. That is a truly fascinating narrative, Richard. It almost makes me forget what actually happened 17 years ago. I shifted my gaze and looked directly at Brenda. Her dramatic fake tears had magically stopped, and she looked suddenly very nervous. You see, Brenda, I remember that freezing Chicago night very differently, I said, keeping my voice low and completely even. I was 16 years old. I had a severe infection and a fever of 104 degrees. I was shivering so violently my teeth were literally rattling in my skull. I begged you to let me stay inside for just one more night so I could sleep off the sickness. I promised I would leave first thing in the morning. Brenda swallowed hard, refusing to meet my eyes. But you physically dragged me out of my bed by my hair. I continued, setting my silver knife down on the pristine white plate. The sharp clink of the metal echoed loudly. You threw my cheap winter coat out into the freezing snow and locked the heavy front door behind me. You told everyone you needed the extra space for your illegal basement poker games, but we both know the real truth, do we not, Brenda? You urgently needed my bedroom because your underground loan shark was coming over to collect a gambling debt and you were paying him off by sleeping with him. You threw your severely sick teenage daughter into a literal winter blizzard so you could use her bed for your cheap, desperate affair. Courtney gasped loudly, dropping her silver fork onto the table. Richard stared at his wife, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray. He clearly had absolutely no idea about the affair. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The pristine, motherly illusion she had just tried to sell me was completely and utterly obliterated. The silence in the private dining room was heavy and suffocating. But her boundless greed was far stronger than her deep shame. She completely ignored the horrified look on Richard's face and the disgusted stare from her golden child. Her greedy eyes darted to the thick legal document resting near her water glass. The fake release form Mr. Donovan had drawn up. The paperwork that secretly transferred $15 million of severe corporate tax debt and federal liability directly onto whoever signed it. Brenda took a deep, shaky breath and completely bypassed my shocking accusation. She reached out and slid the heavy stack of papers across the white tablecloth, pushing it right in front of my plate. She tapped the signature line with her shaking finger. If you sign this right now, the medical conservatorship is completely over. Brenda whispered, her voice tight and desperate. We will walk out of your life forever, Natalie. Just sign the paper right now and you will be completely free. I looked down at the thick stack of legal papers resting next to my half-eaten steak. The document was meticulously drafted by Mr. Donovan exactly as I had instructed. To Richard and Brenda, the bold text at the top of the page read as a standard legal waiver of appeal. It was explicitly worded to look like I was permanently surrendering my right to contest their claim to Uncle Harrison's hidden $15 million trust fund. They truly believed this piece of paper was their ultimate golden ticket out of their massive criminal debts. They thought that by securing my signature, they would officially inherit the massive offshore fortune and immediately pay off the violent loan sharks breathing down their necks. Richard leaned forward eagerly, completely ignoring the horrifying revelation I had just made about his wife's past infidelities. The promise of $15 million had completely blinded him to the absolute destruction of his own marriage. Just sign the waiver right now, Natalie. Richard urged, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. You waive your right to fight us in probate court for the trust fund, and we will immediately dissolve the medical conservatorship. You get your luxury apartment back today. You get your forensic accounting career back tomorrow. We all walk away from this table and never speak to each other again. It is a perfect arrangement for everyone. Courtney sat perfectly still, her greedy eyes darting between the legal document and my face. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, already calculating exactly how many designer bags and fractional private jets she could buy once her parents cashed that massive check. None of them had bothered to read the dense fine print buried deep within the complex legal jargon on page 4. If they had bothered to hire their own independent lawyer or actually read the specific clauses, they would have clearly seen the massive financial trap. The document was not just a simple waiver of appeal, it was a binding assumption of total corporate liability. By signing as my primary legal conservators and accepting the supposed financial assets, they were legally accepting every single ounce of toxic debt, federal tax penalties, and hidden criminal liabilities attached to Uncle Harrison's oldest bankrupt shell companies. They thought I was desperately surrendering my fortune to them to buy my freedom. In reality, I was legally chaining them to a massive sinking ship filled with millions of dollars in federal tax evasion penalties. I looked at the three of them sitting across from me. My biological family. They were sweating under the warm, ambient restaurant lights, completely consumed by their own bottomless greed. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen resting beside the document. The cool metal felt absolutely perfect against my fingers. I uncapped the pen and hovered the fine tip directly over the signature line. Brenda let out a shaky breath of pure relief, her desperate eyes glued to the gold pen. Richard gave a triumphant little smirk, fully believing he had finally beaten his genius daughter. They were standing right on the trapdoor. I pressed the dark ink to the thick paper. The gold pen hovered over the thick paper. Richard could not contain his desperate anticipation any longer. He leaned so far forward across the white tablecloth that his chest nearly touched his expensive plate of food. Just sign it, Natalie, he urged, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of his own boundless greed. Stop playing games and just sign the paper so we can all finally move on with our lives. His eyes were completely wide and practically glowing with the thought of $15 million. He was already spending the money in his head, completely oblivious to the massive legal snare snapping shut around his ankles. I did not hesitate for another second. I pressed the tip of the heavy gold pen against the signature line and signed my name with sharp, fluid strokes. The dark ink soaked into the page, sealing their absolute financial ruin. It was the most satisfying signature of my entire forensic accounting career. I slowly placed the pen down next to the document. I looked up and gave them a calm, chilling smile. I slid the signed document across the smooth table, pushing it directly into Richard's eagerly waiting hands. He immediately snatched it up, clutching the thick stack of papers to his chest like a winning lottery ticket. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, slumping back into her upholstered chair. Courtney was already pulling out her phone, probably to start looking at private jet catalogs again. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They thought they had successfully crushed me and secured their lavish future. They had absolutely no idea that my signature just legally transferred millions of dollars in toxic corporate debt and pending federal penalties directly into their names. I calmly stood up from my chair and smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored suit jacket. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my leather wallet. 17 years ago, in this exact same restaurant, they had kicked me out into the freezing winter night. Richard had tossed a few crumpled dollar bills at my feet, telling me to pay for my own cheap tap water while the rest of the wealthy patrons watched in silence. I had never forgotten the burning humiliation of that exact moment. It was time to return the favor. I pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills and tossed them casually onto the center of the table. They fluttered down, landing right on top of Richard's empty dinner plate. That should more than cover my steak, I said, my voice perfectly cold and steady. Consider it a parting gift. You are going to need every single penny you can get very soon. Richard looked up from the contract, his brow furrowing in sudden confusion, but he was too distracted by his own greed to process my warning. I did not wait for them to respond. I turned my back on my biological family and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I did not look back. I stepped out of the elegant restaurant and into the cool evening air of the city, feeling completely lighter than I had in months. The elaborate trap was fully locked and loaded. All I had to do now was wait for the trap to spring. The very next morning, Richard and Brenda woke up earlier than they had in years. They dressed in their absolute most expensive tailored clothes, completely convinced they were about to become incredibly wealthy. They placed the signed legal document into a pristine leather briefcase, treating the thick stack of paper like a sacred religious artifact. They did not bother to read the dense fine print or consult with an independent financial advisor. Their blinding toxic greed completely overrode any basic sense of logic or caution. They drove straight to the downtown federal courthouse in a luxury rented sedan, practically vibrating with eager excitement. They walked through the heavy marble columns of the courthouse with their heads held extremely high. They genuinely believed they had brilliantly outsmarted everyone. They thought they had successfully crushed their own ungrateful daughter and completely outmaneuvered the dangerous underground loan sharks. Richard marched directly up to the probate clerk window and proudly slid the paperwork across the polished wooden counter. He aggressively demanded an immediate, expedited review, loudly claiming he was the legal medical conservator of the estate and was fully authorized to take total control of the $15 million corporate trust fund. The federal clerk carefully reviewed the signatures and then stamped the documents with a heavy red seal, officially entering them into the permanent government record. The exact moment that red ink hit the paper, the massive legal trap I had meticulously built officially snapped shut. The legal transfer of liability was now permanently codified and completely irreversible in the eyes of the United States government. Richard and Brenda walked out of the federal building, holding hands and laughing together like victorious teenagers. They were already loudly discussing which private tropical island they were going to buy first, and how they would completely cut Jamal out of the money. They had absolutely no idea what they had actually just done. They did not know that my forensic accounting skills were far sharper than their pathetic criminal ambitions. The $15 million trust fund did technically exist, but it was completely radioactive. Uncle Harrison had historically used those specific corporate shell companies to absorb decades of massive toxic debt, failed commercial real estate ventures, and astronomical federal tax penalties. The corporate entities were completely insolvent and had been secretly targeted by the Internal Revenue Service for massive corporate fraud investigations. By eagerly signing that specific acceptance of all estate assets and liabilities document, Richard and Brenda did not just claim a massive fortune. They officially and legally volunteered to take on every single ounce of that toxic financial burden. They explicitly told the federal government, under penalty of perjury, that they were now personally responsible for over $20 million in back taxes and severe corporate fines. They walked into that courthouse blindly thinking they were untouchable millionaires. But they walked out as the primary legal targets of one of the largest federal tax evasion investigations in the entire city. My forensic accounting trap was completely flawless, and they had just eagerly handed the federal government the exact rope needed to hang them both. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung open, and my biological family made their highly anticipated grand entrance. Richard and Brenda walked down the center aisle looking as though they were attending a royal coronation rather than a legal hearing. Brenda was wearing a brand new tweed designer suit that she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card, fully anticipating her massive afternoon payday. Richard strutted right beside her, adjusting a silver silk tie and flashing a sickeningly confident smile at the few people sitting in the gallery. Courtney trailed closely behind them, clutching a rare leather handbag and acting like the entire federal proceeding was simply a minor inconvenience before her next luxury vacation. They took their seats at the front petitioner table, radiating pure, unfiltered arrogance and completely ignoring my quiet presence on the opposite side of the room. I sat perfectly still next to Mr. Donovan, wearing a simple dark business suit. My face was a carefully practiced mask of absolute calm, But inside my forensic accountant brain was rapidly running through the final mathematical calculations of their imminent destruction. I briefly glanced over my shoulder and noticed Jamal sitting completely alone in the very last row of the courtroom. He looked incredibly out of place in his wrinkled clothes from the day before, but his eyes told an entirely different story. He was gripping his jacket pocket tightly, staring at the back of Richard's head with a deeply sinister and calculating glare. He was holding on to his secret audio recording, just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to trade my father's freedom for his own. The fractures in their criminal alliance were about to completely shatter. The heavy wooden gavel cracked against the sounding block as the bailiff called the room to order. The federal judge stepped up to the high mahogany bench. He was a stern man with sharp features and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the massive stack of legal files sitting on his desk. We are here today to officially review the medical conservatorship of Natalie and to formally process the disbursement of the $15 million corporate trust fund established by the late Harrison estate, the judge announced, his deep voice echoing loudly across the silent courtroom. Richard practically vibrated in his leather chair, unable to contain his blinding greed. He leaned over and whispered something to Brenda, causing her to smile brightly and squeeze his hand. They were so entirely consumed by the thought of the massive offshore fortune that they did not even realize the courtroom was quietly shifting. I noticed two men wearing dark windbreakers with federal insignias slip through the side doors and stand silently against the back wall. The judge turned his strict attention directly to my side of the room. "Mr. Donovan," the judge said formally, "please present the final disbursement files and the signed liability agreements for the official court record, so we can rapidly conclude this financial matter." Mr. Donovan stood up slowly, calmly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He did not look like a defeated attorney handing over a family fortune to a group of greedy criminals. He looked exactly like a master chess player about to execute a flawless checkmate. He picked up the thick manila envelope containing the exact legal trap they had so eagerly signed just 24 hours ago. "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Donovan replied, his voice perfectly steady and clear. "I have the fully executed acceptance of all estate assets and liabilities right here." Mr. Donovan did not walk up to the judge's bench alone. He turned to me and gave a small, encouraging nod. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my dark tailored blazer, and walked confidently toward the front of the federal courtroom. A low murmur rippled through the gallery behind me. Richard let out a loud, arrogant scoff, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. He leaned back in his wooden chair, clearly thinking I was about to throw a desperate emotional tantrum to beg for my freedom. Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically and whispered something to Courtney, who snickered quietly. They fully expected me to present a thick stack of new psychiatric evaluations to desperately prove my sanity. They thought I was going to completely waste the court's time arguing about the fake medical conservatorship and begging the judge to release my original $2 million inheritance. But I was a top-tier forensic accountant. I did not deal in fragile emotions or petty personal family grievances. I dealt strictly in hard, undeniable numbers and complex legal financial structures. I did not hand the federal judge a single piece of medical paperwork. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy, meticulously organized binder. I placed it directly onto the high mahogany desk right in front of the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent room. "My legal conservators are under the strict impression that they are here today to collect a $15 million liquid cash disbursement from the Harrison estate. However, as a certified financial investigator, I felt it was my absolute professional duty to provide the federal court with the fully unredacted corporate filings for the exact trust they just legally claimed." The stern judge looked highly intrigued. He opened the heavy binder and began scanning the first few pages. The courtroom was so absolutely quiet, you could hear the crisp rustle of the thick paper turning. Richard abruptly sat up straight in his chair, his arrogant smile faltering for the very first time today. "What exactly is she doing?" Richard hissed at his expensive defense lawyer, who simply shrugged his shoulders in complete confusion. I turned slightly to look directly at my parents. "The trust fund does not contain $15 million in liquid cash assets," I explained, keeping my tone completely clinical and emotionally detached. The $15 million valuation is based entirely on a complex network of Delaware shell companies established over 2 decades ago. I have provided the court with the official state business registries and the corresponding federal tax audits. If you look at Section 4, Your Honor, you will clearly see that these specific corporate entities are completely insolvent. Furthermore, they are currently carrying over $20 million in defaulted commercial real estate loans and severe federal tax evasion penalties. The color completely drained from Richard's face in an instant. He gripped the heavy edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Brenda gasped loudly, her hand flying to her throat as the horrifying reality of my words began to truly set in. By eagerly signing the acceptance of all estate assets and liabilities yesterday morning, my parents legally bypassed the protective corporate veil. I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. They voluntarily transferred all of that toxic corporate debt directly onto themselves as private individuals. They did not inherit a massive offshore fortune. They inherited a massive federal financial crime, and they enthusiastically signed their own names to take full personal responsibility for every single penny of it. The ultimate plot twist had officially been executed, and there was absolutely no way out for them. The heavy silence in the federal courtroom was completely deafening. Richard stood up from the petitioner table, his face a mask of absolute desperation and blinding rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, completely ignoring the strict decorum of the federal judge. "You are lying!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the high marble walls. "You are just trying to confuse the court with forensic accounting tricks because you know you are legally insane. It does not matter what kind of toxic debt you claim exists in those offshore accounts. I am still your legal medical conservator. I still have absolute control over your physical estate. I still control the $2 million in liquid cash, and I still own the deed to the luxury penthouse in Manhattan. You cannot take those assets away from me." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my body to face him directly, standing perfectly straight in my tailored suit. "You really should have hired a competent corporate attorney," Richard Frey said, my voice projecting with calm, lethal authority. "Or at the very least, you should have actually read the foundational estate documents before you committed felony medical fraud to steal them." I turned my attention back to the federal judge, who was watching the exchange with intense, sharp focus. I opened the second section of my heavy leather binder. I slid a new stack of heavily notarized corporate documents across the polished mahogany bench. "Your Honor, my father operates under the completely false assumption that my late Uncle Harrison actually owned personal property," I explained, keeping my tone entirely clinical and detached. "He believes that by securing a fraudulent medical conservatorship over my physical person, he automatically gained total legal access to my uncle's incredible wealth. But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate law and basic asset protection." I looked back at Richard and Brenda, watching the arrogant confidence slowly drain from their faces. "Uncle Harrison was an absolutely brilliant businessman," I continued. "He knew perfectly well that if anything ever happened to him, greedy opportunists would immediately circle his estate like starving vultures. So he meticulously protected his life work using advanced financial structuring. Harrison died with exactly 0 personal assets to his name. He did not own the $2 million in the bank. He did not own the luxury penthouse in Manhattan. He did not own the vintage pocket watch or the expensive furniture. He did not even own the custom-tailored suits hanging in his own closet." Richard let out a harsh, nervous laugh, shaking his head in frantic denial. "That is completely impossible," Richard stammered, looking frantically at his highly paid defense lawyer, who was now furiously flipping through his own legal pads. "We saw the bank statements. We saw the property deeds. We transferred the funds ourselves. They were all completely real." "Oh, the assets are entirely real," I replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "But they do not belong to an individual person. Every single piece of property, every bank account, and every liquid asset was legally transferred into a highly secure private limited liability company based in Delaware over 10 years ago. The shell company is a completely separate legal entity. It is a corporate person under the strict definitions of United States federal law. It pays its own taxes and holds its own distinct legal rights. Brenda gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, her knuckles turning completely white. "But you are the sole heir," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, terrifying realization. "The will specifically said everything was left to you. Since Richard is your legal guardian, he controls everything you own." I shook my head slowly, savoring the exact moment their entire criminal house of cards violently collapsed. "A medical conservatorship only grants you legal authority over my personal individual decisions," I explained clearly, so every single person in the courtroom could understand the absolute magnitude of their failure. "It gives you control over my personal medical care and my personal bank accounts. But I do not own the assets either. I do not personally own the penthouse, and I do not own the $2 million. I paused, letting the heavy silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the absolute final fatal blow. Uncle Harrison did not leave me personal shares in his will. 5 full years ago, he legally appointed me as the sole chief executive officer and primary managing director of that Delaware corporate entity. I am not an heir waiting for a payout. I am the acting executive of a multi-million-dollar private corporation. I have total exclusive fiduciary control over the entire holding company. The federal judge adjusted his reading glasses and meticulously reviewed the corporate registry documents I had just handed him. He traced the state seals and the official timestamps with his index finger. He looked up and nodded slowly, completely validating my statement for the official court record. "The documents are absolutely in order," the judge announced, his deep voice echoing through the silent room. "The state of Delaware formally recognizes Natalie as the sole executive officer of the holding company, with absolute discretionary control over all corporate assets." I turned back to my biological family, watching their entire world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "You cannot put a corporate entity into a medical psychiatric hold," Richard Feiss said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You cannot use a fake doctor's note to seize control of a federal company. When you and Brenda illegally accessed those bank accounts last week, you did not just steal from your mentally incapacitated daughter. You committed massive corporate wire fraud against a private Delaware company." I took a step closer to their table, making sure they heard every single word of their impending doom. "Every single dollar you spent on designer clothes, luxury dinners, and Jamal's extravagant party was directly stolen from a federal corporate account," I continued relentlessly. "You illegally pierced the corporate veil to misappropriate company funds for personal enrichment. The Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission treat corporate embezzlement very differently than a simple family dispute. You are facing mandatory federal minimum sentences for what you have done." Courtney let out a sharp, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked down at the rare, expensive designer handbag resting on her lap, suddenly realizing she was holding direct physical evidence of a massive federal crime. She shoved the bag away from her as if it had suddenly caught fire. Richard collapsed back into his wooden chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He stared blankly at the polished courtroom floor, his mind entirely unable to process the absolute totality of his defeat. He thought he had played the ultimate game of chess against a helpless, grieving girl. He had absolutely no idea he was playing against a master forensic accountant who had rigged the entire board 5 years before the game even started. In the very back row of the courtroom, Jamal sat completely frozen. He slowly pulled his hand out of his jacket pocket, leaving the hidden digital audio recorder behind. He realized in that exact moment that his brilliant blackmail plan was completely worthless. He could not extort money from Richard because Richard never actually had any money to begin with. The $2 million was a corporate mirage, and the $15 million trust fund was a toxic debt trap. Jamal realized he was completely on his own, facing a decade in federal prison for money laundering with absolutely no bargaining chips left to play. The ultimate financial trap had officially closed around every single one of them. The federal judge leaned forward over his high mahogany bench, peering sharply through his reading glasses. The heavy silence in the courtroom was suddenly broken by the rustling of paper as the judge flipped to the specific financial ledgers I had highlighted. Ms. Natalie, the judge, said, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension. If the $2 million in the primary account is indeed corporate capital, what exactly is its legally designated purpose? The court records clearly show that your conservators have already initiated significant withdrawals over the past 48 hours. Richard puffed out his chest, clinging desperately to a final pathetic shred of hope. Exactly? Richard sneered, his voice shaking but unnaturally loud. We already have the cash. The bank cleared the wire transfers yesterday afternoon. You cannot magically undo that. We are your legal guardians and we are entirely entitled to use those funds for your extensive medical and living expenses. We determine exactly what those expenses are, and you cannot touch that money now. I turned my body to look directly at my father, feeling absolutely zero pity. You really should have looked at the specific routing numbers, Richard Y. said, my voice perfectly calm and surgically precise. As the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar holding company, I do not keep $2 million in liquid cash just sitting in a standard checking account for fun. That specific account was a highly restricted corporate escrow fund. Brenda swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between my calm face and the furious expression of the federal judge. An escrow fund for what? Brenda asked, her voice barely a whisper, echoing in the quiet room. For the Internal Revenue Service, I replied, letting the words strike them like physical blows. That $2 million was the exact calculated sum required to settle a massive outstanding corporate tax liability from Uncle Harrison's oldest commercial real estate ventures. It was strictly earmarked and scheduled to be automatically wired to the federal government at the absolute end of this fiscal quarter. Richard's face drained of whatever color it had left. He gripped the edge of the heavy defense table so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. No, he muttered, shaking his head in frantic denial. No, the bank teller said it was a standard family trust account. She handed us the cashier's checks herself. The bank teller saw a corporate account that you illegally accessed using forged psychiatric documents. I corrected him sharply, stepping closer to their table. You did not just withdraw my personal spending money, Richard. You actively intercepted a scheduled federal tax payment. You took $2 million that legally belonged to the United States Treasury, and you used it to buy designer suits, luxury handbags, and to fund a lavish underground party for a money laundering operation. You even used those federal tax funds to try and pay off a violent illegal gambling syndicate in Atlantic City. I turned back to the judge, who was now glaring at my parents with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Your Honor. I continued, my voice projecting with total authority. When they recklessly drained that escrow account, they immediately forced my corporation into severe tax default. And because they willfully misappropriated federal tax funds for their own selfish personal enrichment, they committed felony tax evasion and massive corporate embezzlement. The money they seized was not a slush fund. It was a ticking financial time bomb, and they swallowed it whole. Brenda let out a sharp, horrified wail. She collapsed backward into her wooden chair, completely burying her face in her trembling hands. Courtney violently backed away from her parents, looking at them as if they were suddenly highly contagious. She dropped her rare designer handbag onto the floor, realizing it was purchased with stolen government funds. But I was not finished. The trap was incredibly deep, and I wanted them to see the absolute bottom of it before the darkness swallowed them completely. And that brings us to the $15 million trust fund. I said, my forensic accountant instincts taking complete control of the room. You thought the $2 million was just the appetizer, and the $15 million was the grand main course. You thought you were going to pay off your mob debts and buy a private island. But that $15 million trust fund was never a pile of gold waiting to be claimed. It was the bait. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of his fatal mistake, but I was going to spell it out for the official federal court record anyway. Those Delaware shell companies hold $15 million in toxic defaulted commercial debt, I explained, looking directly into my father's panicked eyes. They are completely underwater. They are a financial black hole. Uncle Harrison kept them strictly quarantined in a separate legal entity, so they would never infect the primary business. But yesterday morning, you and Brenda eagerly signed a binding federal document with Mr. Donovan. You explicitly accepted total personal liability for all of those estate assets and obligations. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the pathetic sound of Brenda's quiet, hysterical sobbing. By eagerly signing that contract to get your hands on a fake offshore fortune, you legally shielded my corporation, I said, offering him a cold, calculating smile. You voluntarily transferred $15 million of toxic underwater debt and massive IRS penalties directly onto your own personal Social Security numbers. You now personally owe the federal government $2 million in stolen tax funds, plus millions more in corporate fraud penalties, and you are entirely legally responsible for a completely bankrupt commercial real estate portfolio. You are not millionaires, Richard. You are the most heavily indebted criminals in the state. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack making every single person in the room jump. This is quite frankly one of the most egregious cases of attempted financial fraud and elder abuse I have ever witnessed, the judge announced, his voice booming with righteous federal authority. Based on the indisputable corporate documents provided by the true chief executive officer, I am immediately and permanently dissolving this fraudulent medical conservatorship. Furthermore, I am ordering the federal marshals present in this courtroom to take Richard and Brenda into immediate custody, pending a full criminal indictment by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Two large federal agents in dark tactical suits stepped forward from the back of the room, their heavy metal handcuffs already drawn. Richard tried to step back, stammering completely incoherently, but his legs entirely gave out beneath him. He fell heavily to his knees on the polished courtroom floor, right in front of the judge's high bench. Brenda screamed hysterically, thrashing her arms as an agent firmly grabbed her wrists and pulled them aggressively behind her back. The sharp click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly. "You set us up," Richard gasped, looking up at me from his knees, his eyes wild with total defeat. "You planned this exact moment from the very beginning." "You set yourselves up, Richard," I replied, looking down at him with absolute emotional detachment. "I just handed you the financial paperwork. Your own blinding, limitless greed did the rest." The federal judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a deafening crack. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot through the high-vaulted ceilings of the courtroom, instantly silencing Brenda's hysterical sobbing and Richard's pathetic muttering. The two federal marshals who had just placed my parents in heavy steel handcuffs forcefully pulled them back up to their feet. Richard and Brenda stood trembling before the high mahogany bench, looking like terrified children as the judge adjusted his microphones to ensure the court stenographer captured every single devastating word of his official ruling. Let the official court record reflect that this tribunal has thoroughly reviewed the corporate registries, the financial ledgers, and the signed legal contracts presented today. The judge began, his deep voice radiating absolute, unforgiving authority. "Richard and Brenda, you came into this federal building this morning, operating under the delusion that you had successfully orchestrated the perfect financial crime against your own flesh and blood. You believed that by weaponizing the psychiatric system, you could steal a massive corporate fortune and walk away completely untouched. But the law is not a weapon you can wield blindly without consequence." The judge picked up the forged medical evaluation that Richard had so proudly submitted just weeks ago. He held the document up in the air for everyone in the gallery to see. "By knowingly presenting a falsified psychiatric evaluation signed by a corrupt medical professional, you did not merely commit perjury in a family court." The judge stated, his eyes locking onto my terrified father. "You utilized that fraudulent document to illegally bypass the security protocols of a federally insured banking institution. You intentionally deceived the bank manager to seize unauthorized control over $2 million that rightfully belonged to a private Delaware corporation." Richard squeezed his eyes shut as the tears of pure defeat finally began to stream down his wrinkled face. He tried to open his mouth to beg for mercy, but the judge raised a hand, instantly cutting him off. "Furthermore," the judge continued, leaning closer to the microphone, "because you initiated a series of electronic wire transfers to drain that specific corporate escrow account, you have crossed the threshold into highly severe federal territory." Every single time you swiped a credit card linked to those stolen funds, to purchase your designer clothing, every time you authorized a digital payment for a luxury auto showroom party, and every time you attempted to wire those stolen federal tax dollars to an illegal gambling syndicate in Atlantic City, you committed a separate, distinct act of federal wire fraud. The United States government takes the misappropriation of its designated tax funds incredibly seriously. You are currently looking at dozens of individual felony counts, and the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines are exceptionally harsh. Brenda let out a low, agonizing moan. Her knees completely buckled under the crushing weight of the judge's words, and the federal marshal had to physically hold her upright by her handcuffed arms. Her perfect hair was a messy disaster, and her expensive tweed suit looked suddenly ridiculous on a woman who was about to spend the rest of her life wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. But the federal judge was not finished. He set down the fake medical evaluation and picked up the thick contract that Mr. Donovan had prepared. The acceptance of all estate assets and liabilities document that my parents had signed with such eager, blinding greed just one day prior. This specific document is perhaps the most astonishing piece of evidence I have ever witnessed in my career, the judge announced, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Driven entirely by your own bottomless greed, you eagerly signed a legally binding indemnification agreement. You explicitly believed you were claiming a hidden $15 million offshore trust fund. But as the chief executive officer of the holding company has masterfully proven today, that trust fund was entirely composed of toxic defaulted commercial real estate debt and astronomical corporate tax evasion penalties. The judge looked directly at my parents, ensuring they understood the absolute inescapable reality of their situation. By affixing your signatures to this contract, you officially and legally indemnified the corporation. You voluntarily shielded this young woman and her company from all financial fallout. Richard and Brenda, you have officially become the sole legal guarantors of over $20 million in federal tax debt. You cannot simply file for personal bankruptcy to escape a federal tax penalty of this magnitude. The Internal Revenue Service will immediately seize your current home, your vehicles, your bank accounts, and any future wages you could ever possibly earn. You will spend the rest of your natural lives entirely impoverished and severely indebted to the United States Treasury. I sat at the petitioner table watching the absolute destruction of the monsters who had thrown me out into the freezing snow 17 years ago. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. They had built their own financial guillotine, placed their own heads on the chopping block, and happily pulled the lever, all because they could not control their desperate desire for unearned wealth. I am hereby permanently dissolving this fraudulent medical conservatorship, the judge declared, striking the gavel one final time. I am restoring all legal and financial rights back to Natalie immediately. Federal marshals, you are ordered to transport Richard and Brenda directly to a federal holding facility. Given their massive underground debts to violent criminal syndicates, they are deemed an extreme flight risk. They will be held without the option for bail, pending their formal criminal arraignment for massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement. Court is adjourned. The federal marshals roughly spun my parents around and began marching them down the center aisle of the courtroom. As they were dragged past my table, Richard turned his head and looked at me one last time. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely stripped of the arrogant pride he had carried his entire life. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I simply looked back at him, my expression perfectly calm, and my posture completely straight. I was the forensic accountant who had finally balanced the family ledger, and the debt they owed me had just been paid in full. Before the federal marshals could fully escort my completely stunned parents out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery violently swung open. A team of stern FBI agents wearing dark suits marched straight down the center aisle. I immediately recognized the lead agent from the devastating raid on Jamal's luxury auto showroom just nights ago. Right beside the lead agent walked Jamal. He was no longer hiding quietly in the back row. He had a sickeningly smug look on his face, even though his wrists were also securely bound in heavy metal cuffs. He had completely sold out my parents to secure a reduced sentence for his own massive money laundering operation. The lead FBI agent stopped directly behind the petitioner table and looked up at the presiding judge. "Your Honor, We apologize for the sudden interruption. The agent announced, his voice echoing loudly. He held up a clear plastic evidence bag containing a cheap black digital audio recorder. We are here to officially execute a federal arrest warrant for Richard and Brenda on additional charges of severe medical fraud, felony bribery, and criminal conspiracy. Richard violently twisted around in the firm grip of the federal marshal, his eyes locking onto his arrogant son-in-law. "You absolute rat!" Richard screamed, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. "You deliberately set us up." Jamal just laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "I explicitly told you I was not going to take the fall for this alone." "Old man." Jamal sneered loudly, entirely ignoring the federal agents holding his arms. "I walked straight into the federal prosecutor's office this morning and cut a massive plea deal. I traded your freedom for a lighter sentence. I gave them absolutely everything." The FBI agent turned his attention back to the judge. "Your Honor, Jamal provided us with highly explicit and verified audio recordings. On these specific digital tapes, Richard explicitly confesses to paying Dr. Aris a $10,000 cash bribe to forge the psychiatric evaluation that initiated this entire fraudulent conservatorship. We already have the corrupt medical professional in federal custody, and he has fully corroborated the entire criminal conspiracy to steal the corporate funds." Courtney, who had been sitting frozen in her chair, suddenly lunged toward Jamal, her face twisted in pure rage. "You completely ruined my life!" Courtney shrieked, trying to claw at his face before an agent swiftly pulled her back. Brenda let out a final breathless gasp and completely fainted, slumping heavily against the federal marshal holding her arms. The absolute betrayal from their own golden child's husband was the final fatal blow to their fragile criminal empire. The toxic family alliance they had built on pure, unfiltered greed had violently cannibalized itself, just as I mathematically predicted it would. The federal agents stepped forward and officially took primary custody of my parents, loudly reading them their Miranda rights over the chaotic noise of the courtroom. The intricate trap was now flawlessly executed. They were completely buried under $20 million of corporate tax debt, and now they were facing multiple decades in federal prison for medical bribery. I calmly packed my forensic accounting ledgers back into my leather briefcase, watching them being dragged out of the federal building. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the federal marshals, carrying away the shattered remains of my biological family. The courtroom suddenly felt incredibly large and perfectly quiet. I stood at the petitioner table, methodically packing my perfectly organized forensic ledgers and legal binders into my dark leather briefcase. I snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp, satisfying click. That was the exact moment the absolute reality of her situation finally crashed down on Courtney. She was standing entirely alone in the center of the federal courtroom. Her parents were headed to a maximum security federal holding facility, facing decades behind bars for medical fraud and tax evasion. Her criminal husband had just publicly confessed to massive money laundering and was also going to a federal penitentiary. Every single bank account she had ever used was permanently frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. Her luxury vehicles were seized, her designer jewelry was confiscated, and her extravagant high society lifestyle was completely and utterly obliterated in a matter of hours. Courtney slowly turned to look at me, her perfect makeup completely ruined by heavy tears of pure, unadulterated panic. The arrogant golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my career and flaunting her stolen wealth was now completely destitute. She stumbled clumsily across the polished marble floor and desperately grabbed the sleeve of my tailored blazer. "Natalie, please." Courtney sobbed, her high-pitched voice cracking with raw terror. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. The federal agents seized my entire house this morning. They took all my bags and my shoes. My platinum credit cards are entirely declined. I do not even have enough money to pay for a cheap taxi ride out of this city. You are the chief executive officer of Uncle Harrison's corporate holding company. You have millions of dollars in that private trust. You are my big sister, Natalie. Please do not leave me here with absolutely nothing. We are family. You cannot just abandon your own flesh and blood." I stopped moving and looked down at her trembling hands clutching my expensive suit jacket. 17 years ago, I was the one crying and begging for help. I was the one shivering uncontrollably in the freezing Chicago snow, while she sat comfortably inside a warm house, completely ignoring my desperate cries for mercy. She had happily worn clothes bought with my stolen inheritance. She had eagerly drank champagne funded by criminal enterprises. I looked into her completely terrified eyes, and I did not feel a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I did not feel the need to scream or yell. I simply felt absolutely nothing for her. She was a complete stranger to me. I reached down and gently but incredibly firmly peeled her shaking fingers off my sleeve. You stopped being my family the exact night you watched them throw a sick 16-year-old girl out into a winter blizzard and did absolutely nothing. I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely emotionally detached. You lived your entire adult life comfortably resting on the money they violently stole from me. You chose to marry a criminal because you were too lazy to earn your own wealth. Now the corporate bank is closed permanently. You have to figure out how to survive in the real world completely on your own. It is time for you to finally grow up, Courtney. She opened her mouth to scream, but I did not give her the chance. I turned my back on her for the absolute final time and walked straight down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her pathetic, hysterical sobbing echoed loudly off the high marble walls behind me, but my footsteps never slowed down. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the federal courthouse and stepped outside into the world. The bright afternoon sunlight washed over me, instantly warming my face and chasing away the cold, sterile air of the legal building. I stood at the top of the wide concrete steps and took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh city air. The suffocating 17-year nightmare was officially over. The heavy, toxic chains that had bound me to my abusive past were completely broken. I was entirely free and entirely independent. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed the direct private number of the senior partner at my old forensic accounting firm. He answered on the very first ring, his voice tight with anxious anticipation to hear the final results of my intense personal legal battle. It is entirely finished, I told him, walking confidently down the wide courthouse steps into the bustling city streets. The medical conservatorship is permanently dissolved. The fraud has been entirely exposed, and they are all currently sitting in federal custody awaiting criminal indictment. I am officially restoring my executive corporate standing today. That is absolutely incredible news, Natalie, he replied, sounding genuinely relieved and highly impressed. We have your corner office completely ready for you. We desperately need our best financial investigator back on the team. I smiled, looking up at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district reflecting the golden sunlight. I appreciate everything the firm has done for me, I said, keeping my tone highly professional, but brimming with new purpose. But I am not coming back to work for you. I am taking my operational capital, and I am opening my own private financial investigation agency. There are plenty of other arrogant criminals out there hiding their toxic secrets behind complex offshore corporate structures, and I am going to hunt every single one of them down. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I merged into the busy crowd of pedestrians moving forward with absolute clear vision. The perfect revenge was never about shouting matches or physical violence. It was quiet, meticulously calculated, and executed with absolute intellectual precision. My family ledger was perfectly balanced, and my brand new life was just beginning. The most profound lesson we can extract from this intricate story is that absolute power does not come from explosive anger or loud emotional confrontations. True power is derived from deep knowledge, emotional mastery, and meticulous preparation. When faced with deep betrayal and toxic family dynamics, the natural human instinct is to react impulsively. We want to scream, cry, and demand immediate justice for the wrongs committed against us. However, this story masterfully demonstrates that the ultimate form of revenge is actually profound personal success combined with strategic silence. The protagonist did not waste her precious energy arguing with her abusers. She understood deeply that greedy and manipulative people are ultimately destroyed by their own toxic desires. By entirely removing her emotions from the equation, she was able to clearly observe their fatal financial weaknesses. She used her specialized education in forensic accounting to build an invisible and inescapable legal trap. She simply laid the groundwork and let their own blinding greed do all the heavy lifting. This teaches us a highly valuable life lesson about dealing with highly toxic individuals. You absolutely do not need to lower yourself to their chaotic level. Instead, you must elevate yourself through rigorous education, self-reliance, and unwavering discipline. When you focus entirely on building your own professional skills and securing your own financial independence, you become completely untouchable. The people who try to manipulate or steal from you will inevitably walk blindly into the devastating consequences of their own dark actions. True justice is rarely loud. It is calculated, precise, and perfectly balanced. Master your craft and use that expertise to protect your peace. The greatest victory is walking away into a bright future where you are completely free and entirely self-sufficient.